anybody there? Hello?
Welcome to episode 41 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring themes of identity and the fragility of reality, with two films that flew under the radar at the time of their initial release, but which have both gone on to gain well-deserved cult followings. First up, we have The Empty Man from 2020, starring James Badge Dale, Aaron Poole and Marin Ireland. This was written and directed by David Pryor and was based on a comic book series by Cullen Bunn and Vanessa R. Del Rey. Then we follow this with Beyond the Black Rainbow from 2010. This stars Michael Rogers and Eva Allen and is the featured debut from director Panos Cosmatos. Along the way, we'll be discussing the career of director David Pryor, the 1972 Philip experiment conducted in Toronto, Canada, the 1980s video store inspirations of Panos Cosmatos, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, as always, I'd just like to mention the key sources that I've used when preparing this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in these show notes. So when talking about The Empty Man, I have referred to interviews with David Pryor on the websites fincheranalyst.com, thrilllist.com, mubi.com and theplaylist.net. And when discussing Beyond the Black Rainbow, I have referred to interviews with Panos Cosmatos on the websites vancouversun.com, complex.com, chud.com, thatshelf.com, filmmakermagazine.com and thefilmstage.com. And as always, I've also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the movies, cast and crew. All of which brings us on to our first film of the week, which is The Empty Man, which was completed in 2018 but released in 2020. This stars James Badge Dale, Aaron Poole and Marin Ireland, and was written and directed by David Pryor. And we are going to get into the spoilers for both the comic book and the movie very early this week, including the major surprise of the film's ending, so as always, please tread with caution moving forward. The Empty Man was inspired by an 8-part series of comic books of the same name that were written by Cullen Bunn and illustrated by Vanessa R. Del Rey and Jesus Hervas. These were published by Boom Studios beginning in 2014. Cullen Bunn is an American comics writer, novelist and short story writer, and he has worked for Marvel Comics, DC and Valiant. He's also published creator-owned comics, including The Sixth Gun, The Damned, Harrow County, and of course The Empty Man. A New York Times best-selling writer, he has been described as a master storyteller with a unique personal vision, as well as being a quote-unquote comics dynamo. The first Empty Man comic was published in 2014 by Boom Studios and was initially a collaboration with the artist Vanessa R. Del Rey, with the illustrations for later issues created by Jesus Hervas. Very different to the film version, the narrative of the comics takes place long after The Empty Man has gained a foothold into our reality, and focus on an investigation into a worldwide pandemic known simply, and unsurprisingly, as the Empty Man. This disease has already emerged several years before the events of the first issue, and Bunn describes it as, quote, a kind of contagious insanity accompanied by horrible hallucinations and suicidal or homicidal tendencies. How the disease spreads is not clear, and the pattern appears to be almost completely random. Since the first recorded case of the disease, numerous fringe religious groups have started worshipping it as if it was some kind of primordial god." End quote. A joint FBI and CDC task force is created to investigate, headed up by agents Walter Langford and Monica Jensen. And this is a somewhat mismatched pairing, as is always the way in these stories, who are charged with discovering the cause of the disease and also the associated cult activity. And this narrative makes it as much as a police procedural as it is a journey into cosmic horror. What the agents don't realise Bunn has said is that the disease has started to mutate and change, and some of the hallucinations the disease causes are far too real. To make matters worse, he continues, both Langford and Jensen are dealing with some personal tragedies that will impact how they do their jobs. Bunn has said that the inspiration for the story had been with him for a long time, with the original idea emerging on a road trip when the phrase, "the empty man made me do it," popped into his head. Over the next couple of years, he said that he kept returning to that phrase, and the story started to take shape around it. A lover of horror and dark fantasy from an early age, the scope and characters of the Empty Man comics were very different to those that he had tackled previously, and he said that the narrative was inspired by world events and films like Ringu, Jacob's Ladder, and Ju-on the Grudge, as well, of course, as works by H.P. Lovecraft. Boom Studios, the publisher of the comics, had been looking to move into film production since the mid-2000s, and an adaptation of their comic book series Two Guns was released as a co-production with Universal in 2013. Starring Denzel Washington, Bill Paxton, and Mark Wahlberg, the film was not particularly well received by critics at the time of its release, but it debuted at the top of the US box office during its opening weekend and earned $131 million worldwide against a budget of $61 million. Keen to make more, Boom signed a first-look deal with 20th Century Fox for movie development in 2013 and TV development a year later. Boom also established a specific department to oversee television, film, and animation. Co-founder Ross Ritchie began having conversations with various directors, discussing what properties would make a good transfer into film, and one of these directors was David Pryor. Although The Empty Man would be Pryor's feature directorial debut, he had worked in Hollywood for years, including freelance writing, visual effects, and occasional acting work. In 1999, he was working for Sony on a project involving their telecine, transferring film into video formats. When he heard that his friend Charlie was working on the DVD transfer of the film Alien, he suggested that Charlie bring the project to Sony, who at the time had the best telecine equipment in the business. And this gave him a valuable connection, which helped him to secure his first real break. Around this time, the film Ravenous was released, a historical cannibal movie starring Guy Pearce, Robert Carlyle, and David Arquette, and this is a film we mentioned very briefly back in episode 10. Pryor says that he went to see it in defiance of the film's misleading and poor marketing campaign, figuring that anything directed by Antonio Bird with that cast had to be more interesting than the trailers let on, which is rather ironic considering what would happen to his own film many years later, but more on that shortly. Falling in love with the movie, he went to see it a further 3 or 4 times before it was very quickly pulled from theatres. Almost on a whim, he told some of his contacts at Fox, who he had met through Alien, that they had a special movie on their hands, and that they should consider doing a special edition DVD of the release. And lo and behold, he says, they agreed and gave him the job. After the success of this project, which sold 3 times its initial projections, he was given his pick of future home releases, and as a fan of David Fincher, asked to do the special edition for Fight Club, which was just being finished at the time. Fincher and Fox were very happy with the end results, and Pryor worked on more special edition versions of his movies for the next few years. This included shooting behind-the-scenes documentaries and interviews for films including Zodiac, The Social Network, and The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. But feature directing was Pryor's ultimate ambition. He had said that movies were his earliest and most passionate love, So much so that by the time he was 6 years old, he had already told his mother that was what he wanted to do when he grew up. He says that all of the other jobs he held, from visual effects to acting, art direction and making documentaries, were really things he was doing in the meantime while trying to get his own films made. In 2008, he made his short film debut with AM 1200, starring Eric Lang and Ray Wise. A very effective and genuinely creepy combination of white-collar crime and cosmic horror, the film shifted Hollywood's perception of his capabilities. This was helped in no small part by David Fincher's analysis that the film indicated Pryor to be one of the most promising directors that he'd ever seen. It's available on YouTube, and if you like The Empty Man, or you are a fan of the darker realms of cosmic horror, then I highly recommend it. It includes a dry run of the truly incredible map transition of The Empty Man, and with its catchphrase of "It transmits, we receive," also shares a fair amount of that film's DNA. At moments, it also had me wishing that Pryor had been given the opportunity to direct any of the Silent Hill movies, though sadly, as we all know, this was not to be the case. I'll link it in the show notes for anyone who's interested in watching. But while AM 1200 opened the door, it took a while for him to find the right project, saying that he spent many years developing films that came close to happening, but then didn't. At the same time, he says, quote, turning down every second-rate vampire or exorcism or ghost franchise movie that was coming down the pike, end quote. And then Ross Ritchie sent him a copy of The Empty Man. Pryor was immediately gripped by the central concept, particularly the notion of cults, a theme that underpins the comic book series and the second half of his movie. Saying that this stems from a lifelong fascination with H.P. Lovecraft, he is particularly fascinated that people sign up for what he calls a violently different reality, describing it as the war over who gets to define the truth. He set about adapting the material into a screenplay, using the basic concept of the story as a foundation for his own narrative. He has said that the adaptation is close to the source material in spirit but not in detail, going on to say that while the film may be very different from the comic in many ways, in a larger and deeper sense the two are still closely intertwined. Quote, portions of it were based on material I'd been wrestling with and writing in one form or another for several years. But adapting the comic catalyzed and helped express all of those things. The script is its own beast, but it wouldn't exist without the comic. I think the most interesting things Cullen was wrestling with find expression in the movie, however obliquely. At least, I hope they do. End quote. One of the starting points for the story came to Pryor several years before he was sent the graphic novel. One night, he and his son drove to the old Chain of Rocks Bridge, which spans the Mississippi and which was used at the end of John Carpenter's 1981 movie, Escape from New York. He says they drove out to the bridge at 9 o'clock at night, and it was pitch black, completely deserted, and utterly terrifying. Quote, it's a large bridge, over a mile long. A huge behemoth. There was something so utterly spooky about it that I remember thinking, I'm going to make a movie out of this. End quote. And indeed he did. Imagery of bridges appears throughout the movie, both physical and metaphorical. The Empty Man begins in 1995 Bhutan, a predominantly Buddhist area in the eastern Himalayas, though in reality this is actually Cape Town, South Africa, where the majority of filming took place. We meet a group of friends, Paul, Greg, Ruthie and Fiona, who are hiking up a mountain and whose journey takes them across the first of many bridges that act as metaphors in the film. Hearing a strange noise, Paul falls into a crevice and Greg has to abseil down to save him. Paul, incidentally, is played by the actor Aaron Poole, who we last saw on this podcast in 2012's The Conspiracy. So it's good to know that he has learned nothing from that experience and that his curiosity is still getting people into trouble. Deep in a cave below, Greg finds Paul apparently physically unharmed, but sitting in reverence, or possibly terror, in front of an ancient humanoid skeleton that dominates the cave with its sheer size. This was created by freelance character and creature designer Ken Barthélemy, whose work includes 2017's It and Godzilla King of the Monsters from 2019. When Barthélemy was brought on to design what the crew called the quote-unquote cave mummy, a skeleton had already been designed by another artist, but Pryor didn't feel that it was working. Asked to start again from scratch, he designed and 3D sculpted a new cave mummy, working from a brief that it should reference ancient age, authority and menace, and also be subtly more than human. Other references were the space jockey from 1979's Alien and paintings by the Polish artist Zdzisław Beskiński. I can't say for certain which paintings Pryor recommended, but looking at Beskiński's work, I would suggest that an untitled painting known as The Flutist was probably among them. Paul tells Greg that if he touches him, Greg will die, but Greg ignores the warning and carries Paul out of the cavern. He also brings with them a primitive wind instrument that will become important later. Trapped by a sudden snowstorm, and with Paul almost catatonic, the group takes shelter in a nearby abandoned cabin. Fiona and Greg go to find help, but are driven back by the storm, though not before Ruthie is menaced by a tall figure in black robes, which appears outside the cabin. That night, while everyone sleeps, we see Paul whispering into Ruthie's ear, and then the next day the friends wake to find him missing. After searching, they find him sitting in the snow, facing the bridge that they had crossed the day before, and blowing across the strange whistle that they found in the cave. Suddenly, Ruthie appears to fall into a trance and kills both Greg and Fiona before taking her own life. We then see Paul shed a single tear as he watches his friends die, and the opening titles appear on the screen. This prologue sets up a sense of real cosmic dread, particularly with the giant humanoid figure. It's an impressive opening, though I have to say that the CGI blood during the murders does cheapen the effect just a little. But in any case, the prologue sets up many of the film's themes very well. Paul, we have learned, has suffered from mental health issues in the past, which is central to how the empty man enters his vessels. And the prologue also establishes the 3-day countdown that is central to the film. And this, of course, is reminiscent of films like Ringu and its US remake The Ring, which sets up similar countdown to doom story structures. But then, 20 minutes into the film and after the opening titles, all of a sudden we are in small-town Missouri 23 years later, and seemingly in a very different movie. On first viewing, the change was initially so jarring for me that I wondered if I had been the victim of a cinematic bait and switch. At this point, the film seems to be devolving into teen slasher territory, more akin to the cinematic misses of the Slender Man and, God help us, the Bye Bye Man, than the cosmic nightmare promised by the prologue. We now meet James L'Assemblée, jogging across a bridge towards the camera. We soon find out that he owns a personal security store, has no small amount of personal trauma, and is an all-round honest guy. After seeing him strangely focused on the flame of a lighter, we discover that it's his birthday, and he goes for a free birthday dinner at a local restaurant called El Caballete. When he returns home, we are introduced to Amanda, a young girl who is waiting for James's arrival in the garden. Amanda is rather intense, to say the least, and also appears to be wildly insensitive, quite literally throwing James's past trauma in his face and referencing his dead wife and child. Quote, "It's been almost a year. I was concerned about you. Maybe you think that's silly. Ever since my father died, and so soon after when Alison and Henry, I mean, it was more than any of us could bear. Any of us. I myself felt like I was going to burst into 1 million pieces." End quote. Gosh, thanks, Amanda. You really know how to cheer a guy up on his birthday. However, there is an intent behind this, as we later find out, and more on that in a moment. And there is also more than meets the eye to her next words, when she appears to be telling James all about a mysterious cult. In this exchange, David Pryor not only spells out the belief system of the soon-to-be-introduced Pontifex Institute, But he also deliberately telegraphs the basic plot of the film, something that becomes all too clear on a second viewing. "I came to tell you," Amanda says, "that I found something so wonderful and so freeing, and it's helped me to realize that nothing can hurt you because nothing is real." When James responds that a lot of things are real, Amanda just smiles and asks, "Are they? How would you know?" "What's real starts here," she says, indicating her head, "and it ends up out here," she says, gesturing to the outside world. Going on to say, quote, "What we think about with focus and intention and repetition, we manifest. It's the power of positive thinking, the power of negative thinking, right? But what if there's a secret truth? What if our thoughts actually begin somewhere else, and they travel through us like a signal traveling down a wire? Thoughts that are old and hidden and singular." And when James responds that he has no idea what Amanda's talking about, she just laughs and says, "Yes, you do. Of course you do." Amanda then leaves, asking James if it is okay that she speaks about their meeting to her mother. As she leaves, a murmuring of starlings swoop across the sky, and they briefly form a strange pattern. This, we later learn, is the logo of the Pontifex Institute, an effect that even the director has admitted might be too subtle for its own good. "It's there if you're looking for it," he says, but so far nobody has seen it. The next day, Amanda goes missing, and her mother, Nora, asks James for his help. The only message that Amanda has left behind is a mirror smeared with the words, "The empty man made me do it," apparently in blood. Looking through Amanda's things, James finds a sketchbook filled with dark drawings, including the refrain, "He is here, he is there, he is every fucking where." There's also a piece of paper with the logo for the Pontifex Institute on one side, and on the other, handwritten, the word tulpa. And so begins James's investigation into Amanda's disappearance and the mysterious Pontifex Institute, which will become central to the story. But before we continue, let's have a not-so-quick word about tulpas. A tulpa originates from Tibetan mysticism and is a thought form or sentient independent being that is created through intense spiritual practice and concentration. And this, of course, links directly back to Amanda's monologue about the nature of reality in the garden. What we think about with focus and intention and repetition, we manifest. The idea of using a tulpa as a plot device was inspired by a 1997 novel called Superstition by a writer called David Ambrose. Pryor had been talking to the copyright holders about a film adaptation, but this never came to fruition. But the idea of the tulpa, which is central to the narrative of the novel, stayed with him. Superstition tells the story of an investigative journalist called Joanna, who specializes in uncovering fraudulent psychics. She is invited to participate in an experiment to quote-unquote create a ghost. During the experiment, Joanna, the scientist, and a group of volunteers manifest poltergeist activity and supernatural messages, all from a fictional spirit that they have created and named Adam. The experiment, therefore, seems to be a huge success. The only problem is that Adam doesn't really want to go away once the experiment is over. It's an interesting premise, and the narrative is rather similar to a 2014 movie called The Quiet Ones, produced by Hammer Studios and starring Jared Harris and Sam Claflin. And it is probably very likely that both works took their inspiration from a real-life scientific experiment conducted in Canada in 1972, and which may be the closest that science has actually come to creating a tulpa. This is known as the Philip experiment, and it was conducted by a Toronto parapsychological society led by a mathematician named Dr. A.R. Owen and a psychologist called Dr. Joel Witten. The test group were made up of Owen's wife Iris, a former chairperson of Mensa, an industrial designer and his wife, a heating engineer, an accountant, a bookkeeper, and a sociology student. The goal of the experiment was to create a fictional character through a deliberate methodology and then attempt to communicate with it through seance. Ultimately, the objective was to prove whether human subjects can communicate with a fictional ghost through sheer force of the will. The character they created was called Philip Aylesford, who was given a constructed and detailed written backstory on which the group all agreed. And this is something that we also see in action in The Empty Man. The group were then seated around a table under scientific conditions, but the initial attempts to hold a seance with Philip yielded no communication or phenomena at all. Owen then decided to change the conditions, dimming the lights and emulating what we would call a traditional seance atmosphere. At this point, the participants reported feeling a presence. They also noticed table vibrations, unexpected echoes, and rapping sounds which matched responses to questions about Philip's fictional life. At one point, apparently, the table tilted on a single leg and also moved across the room without any human contact at all. Although Philip initially only existed in the minds of the participants, the group eventually came to believe that they had manifested an intelligent spirit that could communicate with them. However, the experiment was widely criticized at the time, and also retrospectively, for lacking solid scientific controls and providing ambiguous results. Was Philip a tulpa? Possibly, though it is also possible that the group's unconscious bias to a favorable outcome may have colored perception and also results. As the experiment was only captured through audio recording and not video, we have no way of knowing exactly what happened. But, as I say, it was enough to inspire the film The Quiet Ones in 2014 and another called The Apparition in 2012. Tulpas have also appeared in other horror media, including Stephen King's novel The Dark Half, which was directed for the screen by George A. Romero in 1993, and an Italian movie called Tulpa, The Demon of Desire, which was released in 2012. There are also those who point to The Babadook from 2014, suggesting that the titular monster is a manifestation of stress and rage. A personal favourite, though, is David Cronenberg's 1979 horror The Brood, in which a character's rage gives birth to deformed homicidal children. And there's also a little-seen 2004 German anthology movie called Tears of Kali. This film presents 3 stories surrounding the mysterious Taylor Erickson Group, a self-help organisation originating from Pune, India, in the 1970s. In the film, we gradually learn of the group's experiments with human consciousness, all of which have predictably nasty results, including, in at least one story, the creation of a tulpa, which acts out the unconscious rage of one of the characters. I haven't seen it since the early 2000s, so I can't say whether it has aged particularly well. But I do remember that it opens with a blonde girl cutting off her eyelids with a pair of scissors, so you know what you're letting yourself in for if you decide to track it down. Pryor was very struck by the concept and realised that it was one that would translate well to The Empty Man, particularly with its focus on cults and the nature of reality. Unfortunately, he was nearly finished with the screenplay when the idea struck him, and he realised that it meant he would have to go back and rewrite everything that had gone before. But the idea was a good one, and although he described the idea as having a ripple effect that took a while to settle down, he went back and made the required changes. And at this point, I'm going to fast forward to the ending of the film, so once again, if you haven't seen the movie, now is a good time to hit pause, as I am about to spoil everything. At the end of the film, it is revealed that James is not a real person at all, or at least not in the way that we would recognise one. He is a tulpa, a thought form made flesh, created with the sole purpose of being a vessel for the monstrous figure that we saw in the caves, a being that is referred to as the Between One. The Institute are paving the way for the Between One's entry into the world, allowing him to remove all boundaries and replacing them with an endless black chaos. To do this, he needs someone to be his vessel, someone to be his quote-unquote bridge. Poole, who has been his vessel for over 2 decades since the accident in Bhutan, is in a coma in a hospital and his body is giving out. As a result, Amanda and others at the Pontifex Institute created James as a tulpa to be the next host. All of his memories, all of his past, were just part of the invention. The empty man is not, as we might have supposed, the giant being in the mountains. It is, in fact, James. The reason that the group gave James such a troubled past is because the entity finds its way in through suffering and pain, and this is why Poole, with his history of mental health issues, was the perfect candidate back in Bhutan. This also, on second viewing at least, explains Amanda's insensitivity when discussing James's personal tragedies. It is in her interest to trigger his pain to make him a more accommodating vessel. It also accounts for her mocking response when he tells her that some things are real, and when she responds, "Are they? How would you know?" On second viewing, it is apparent that Amanda's real presence in the garden is to check up on her creation, and when she says she came to see how he is doing, she is being completely honest, even if the intent is not what we first suppose. It's probably safe to assume, then, that he has literally been thought into existence that very day, which is, of course, his birthday. This also explains the odd fascination he has staring at a lighter flame in the back room of his office, seeing it as if for the first time, because that is quite literally what is happening. And it is with this revelation that all of the bridge metaphors make perfect sense. As well as the obvious visual references, we first see James crossing a bridge. The name of the restaurant where he has his birthday meal translates literally to the bridge, and even the name of the Pontifex Institute translates to bridge builder. And if that were not enough, there is also the mantra heard by James as he explores the Institute's basement. Quote, "From the bridge comes the man. From the man comes his thoughts. From his thoughts come the dreams. From the dreams come the power. From the power comes the bridge. From the bridge comes the man." End quote. The reveal, of course, throws the film into a whole new light, as we realise that much of what we have seen is just an implanted memory, and that Nora, with whom he was supposedly having an affair, has no idea who he is. This does raise the question of whether anything we have seen is real at all, something that still may not be clearer on second or third viewing. There are, of course, online numerous conversations about this, a debate that will doubtless lead to the film becoming a certified cult classic, something for fans to ponder over and, I'm sure, occasionally argue about. Some believe that everything up to the climax is an implanted memory designed to create as traumatized a vessel as possible, while others suggest that parts of the film take place in the real world and other parts do not. My personal opinion, for what it's worth, is that he is born the moment we see him crossing the bridge at the beginning, and that aspects of the film, such as the investigation into the cult, are very real, while others, like his interactions with Nora, are just his programming. Now, admittedly, that theory doesn't really hold up to much scrutiny, particularly given the bird-made Pontifex logo after Amanda's visit, but that's the one I've settled with for now. Amanda is played by actress Sasha Frolova, and she gives a very good performance. And in fact, it's only when you watch it a second time that you realise how good a performance it is. A second viewing also, by the way, makes you want to hate the character even more, especially her manipulative doublespeak, which is somehow even worse than when she finally reveals the truth at the end of the film. Pryor's vision for Amanda was originally very different, seeing her more as a blonde girl next door type than the remarkably intense Frolova. But when he saw Frolova's tape, he knew that she was right for the part, saying that her take was fascinating. He recalled that she didn't have the lines down at all, and was almost making up dialogue as she went along, dropping his lines and adding in her own. He said that although it was incredibly undisciplined, she had a quality about her that made her perfect for the role. And she does indeed have a quality, an otherworldliness about her that lends itself perfectly to the nature of the film and also to the character of the rather snake-like Amanda, who, as we find out in the film's climax, has been pulling James's strings all along. There are, of course, parallels between The Empty Man and other films, including John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, a movie we discussed in depth at the start of the year. Pryor has seen other parallels too, though unfortunately these were with films that coincided with the completion of filming. Quote, "When we finished and the movie is almost done, Twin Peaks Season 3 comes out and there are characters that are tulpas in it. And then the same thing happened with Hereditary. I saw Hereditary after we locked Final Picture. It came out and we were already finished and it was just dispiriting." End quote. James La Sombra, a name which translates to James the Shadow, is played by James Badge Dale, an American actor who made his film debut with the 1990 version of Lord of the Flies. Following this, he appeared in films including 2006 The Departed and Iron Man 3 in 2012, as well as roles in TV shows including 24, CSI and Rubicon, a 2010 series that first brought him to Pryor's attention. On seeing the series, he knew that Dale would be the perfect person for the role, noting that a lot of Rubicon's effect hinged on how interesting the actor was to watch, doing pretty much nothing. He went on to say, quote, "There is a sense of inner conflict that just oozes out of him if you encourage it, and it makes him so intriguing to watch. He's got real courage as an actor, and if you trust him and he trusts you, he goes to some deep and vulnerable places." End quote. It's a very good performance, and you can feel the growing sense of paranoia and breakdown developing in the character as the film progresses. While he might initially bring an everyman quality that is, as it turns out, deliberately stereotypical, by the end, when the truth finally hits, you feel the character's desperation and his grief intimately. The rather trope-laden nature of James's character was deliberate, not just for the sake of the story, but also as a meta-commentary on the nature of many horror film protagonists, who at the time all seemed to be damaged or broken in some way before their films had even begun. Of this, Pryor has said, quote, "There's certainly an element of taking the piss out of that trope that was front of mind. Trauma has been a genre staple for a long time, even if it's a bit more up on its hind legs than it used to be. But beyond the humour of it, I think you're dealing with some chaotic force that symbolises the end of meaning. The fact that it can only enter a damaged vessel is interesting and resonates in a few ways. If you follow that trail, what does it say about where we are as a civilization? How are we collectively dealing with our trauma?" End quote. The way that the Pontifex Institute seems to deal with trauma is through nihilism, demonstrated not just in the lengthy speech delivered by leader Arthur Parsons, but also in the questionnaire that we barely glimpse when James first visits. This is filled with statements, including rational thought is deadly, some truths are socially intolerable, the scientific method is a tool of oppression, and if science says the sky is blue, it is more likely red. Parsons, as played by the brilliant Stephen Root, is less a stereotypical cult leader and more of a businessman, drawing comparisons from some quarters to the Church of Scientology. While I couldn't possibly comment on that, he is certainly reminiscent of any number of gurus we have seen over the decades, including recent social media personalities who may or may not have faked their qualifications and their religious training to make themselves seem more mysterious. As we will see later, there is a vast amount of money to be made in quote-unquote helping people, regardless of actual experience or qualifications, as long as the philosophy sounds good enough. There is no struggle because there are no distinctions, Parsons says. To say that you are wrong or I am right is to divide us. Therefore, we deny that there is such a thing as right or wrong. These are exclusionary constructs, designed to foster the illusion of separateness. There is no such thing as disunity. There is only the great binding nothingness of things. At one time we were one. We will all be one again. This message comes to you directly from the empty man. He also has a fantastic interaction with James regarding language and the fact that things have been rendered meaningless by repetition, citing Nietzsche's famous line about staring into the abyss. This theme is also underlined by the fact that the high school is named after Jacques Derrida, a philosopher who developed the theory of deconstruction. This theory focuses on the relationship between words and their meaning, especially the idea that words only have meaning because of their contrasting relationship with other words. For example, the word being only has meaning if it's contrasted with the word nothing. And it's not too far a leap from here to the mantra overheard at the Pontifex Institute. Nothing exists. Even if something exists, nothing can be known about it. Even if something can be known about it, knowledge about it can't be communicated to others. Even if it can be communicated, it cannot be understood. For Pryor, the essence of the cult is a reflection of what he sees happening in modern society, something that he describes as destruction without refortification, saying, quote, "The purpose is to take social norms and cultural institutions and break them down, redefine them and hollow them out. Sometimes that needs to happen, but if you're not replacing it with something that's equally persuasive or fundamental or important or valuable or humane or true, then it's highly dangerous." End quote. James's investigation takes him first to one of Amanda's friends, who recounts the urban legend of the empty man, which begins to push the film into Candyman territory. She also tells him of an experience on a bridge where she, Amanda, and some friends try to invoke the entity by blowing over a bottle, which is a fairly nice callback to the wooden whistle that we discovered in Bhutan. Despite a very atmospheric moment on the bridge after the invocation, this for me is possibly the weakest section of the story, so I'll move very quickly on to James's next step in the investigation, which is his visit to the Institute. Here he exchanges philosophy with Parsons, who obliquely says, "Nice to see you again," as the two part company. And incidentally, Pryor has said that he tried to hide Amanda in some of these shots, so look out for her next time you watch the film. Looking for clues, James then wanders into the basement of the centre. Here he walks past a mysterious file labelled Manifestation 14, something that will have a far more ominous significance later, and he also sees an invocation to the empty man. And from here we move, via a few detours, to the movie's main set piece, and my favourite moment in the film. This is an investigation into the woodlands where a previous Pontifex experiment has gone very wrong. Not only do we witness a video recording of an early attempt to create a tulpa on a VHS cassette marked Manifestation 13, but we also witness a ceremony right from Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, which pushes the film fully into the world of cosmic horror. The cult dances around a fire, the flames grow higher, the stars swirl in the heavens, and then the cult, as one, move in complete synchronicity with James, a brilliantly effective moment that is one of the most unnerving in the film. Not that the rest of the film is without unnerving moments, though my one critique is that perhaps there are one or two too many. Quite honestly, for me, the teen subplot could easily have been dropped altogether. As I mentioned earlier, this for me swerves temporarily into teen slasher fare, which isn't my favourite subgenre, and I think dropping it would have made for a tighter film and a far greater sense of dread. What does build a sense of dread, though, is the score, composed by Welsh musician Lusmord and composer Christopher Young, creating a hybrid of classic film score with the experimental. Lusmord, also known as Brian Williams, began his recording career in the 1980s, starting off in industrial music, a style which filters through his work for the film. Once called a reluctant pioneer of the dark ambient genre, who regards his music as neither dark nor ambient, Williams has also worked on soundtracks, including the 1994 version of The Crow, Vacancy in 2007, and the TV series The Strain. Pryor had been listening to his work throughout the writing process, and so he was a natural choice. The film began shooting in 2016 in Cape Town, South Africa, with exteriors planned to be filmed in Chicago in December. But the Chicago filming was delayed due to terrible snowstorms, and the production was put on hold. During this break, their studio executive at Fox was released from their contract. Suddenly, the filmmakers were without a supportive executive in a studio that really wasn't that interested in their project anymore. In July of 2017, a new executive was brought in and the shoot was finished. But then, in 2018, the studio insisted on a test screening long before Pryor was ready to show it. Although he pled his case, as one would expect, the studio won the argument. The test screening was a disaster, with incredibly low test scores, leaving the studio far less than happy. Without Pryor's knowledge, they arranged for a new 90-minute cut of the film to be made, but this tested even lower. Relenting, Fox agreed to let Pryor finish his film, but they rushed him through the process. And just to compound problems even further, not that any help was needed, Fox was then purchased by Disney, and according to Pryor, he couldn't get anyone to answer their phones anymore. Eventually, Disney decided to release the film, which, according to Pryor, is still a rougher cut than he would have liked. The initial release was set for August 2019, but then it was pushed back to December, and then to spring 2020. Then the pandemic hit, and it was pushed back to October, when it was finally released. Even then, though, the release can best be described as a half-hearted effort. Pryor was not consulted on any of the marketing campaign, despite this being in his contract. To his horror, he found that the trailer didn't reflect the film's content, woefully misleading the people who did go to see it. And the real pity of this is that Pryor had already planned a marketing campaign that could potentially have pushed the movie into Blair Witch phenomenon territory. Quote, "Initially, the plan was to have people in the Czech Republic writing who is the empty man on the side of building walls, getting people talking about it, and releasing little web videos. I had an extended version of the Manifestation 13 video that James watches in the cabin that was set to be released on the internet, and we had this whole thing planned out. All of that went out of the window. But you take the good, you take the bad, and there you have it. It's the facts of life." End quote. Sadly, the poor marketing campaign, if one can indeed call it a campaign, coupled with its release during a pandemic, appeared to be the final nail in the empty man's coffin. People stayed away, and reviews were, on the whole, very negative. As Pryor later put it, quote, "When you have a marketing campaign that is designed to attract the wrong audience and repel the right audience, you're going to get all those people on opening night going, what the fuck is this? This is not what the trailer promised me it was going to be." So there was a lot of discombobulation. End quote. What a great word. But like any eldritch god worth his salt, The Empty Man did not stay sleeping for long. Released on digital at the same time as the theatrical release, it began to gain a cult following, which is rather appropriate given the nature of the film. Word of mouth began to spread among horror fans that it was a film worth watching, and not to be put off by the misdirection of the marketing, something that recalls Pryor's own experience watching Ravenous back in 1999. Since that point, The Empty Man has built a steady following of devotees, intrigued by its central premise and the Russian doll nature of its narrative. It's certainly a film that bears repeat viewing, allowing you to unravel its philosophies and meanings while looking for clues that you missed the first time around. And while it may be flawed in places, it is a far more original story than many studio horrors we have seen over recent years, and for that alone, it should be celebrated. Following The Empty Man, David Pryor co-produced a series called Voir with David Fincher, also directing 2 episodes. This documentary love letter to cinema focuses on film lovers exploring the moments in movies that changed them, including Jaws, Lawrence of Arabia, and Lady Vengeance. No mention at all, sadly, for killer clowns from outer space, but I guess they were just asking the wrong people. He followed this with the Autopsy, his contribution to Guillermo del Toro's Netflix series Cabinet of Curiosities. According to IMDb, this was one of the series' top-rated episodes, and I would have to agree. I thought this story, and one other, were the highlights in what was for me a rather hit-and-miss series. In his episode, however, Pryor really delivers, giving us a combination of body and cosmic horror which combines impressive characterization with excellent cinematography and special effects. In fact, I would suggest that this episode, based on a short story by Michael Shea, was far more effectively Lovecraftian than the two actual Lovecraft adaptations in the series. Happily, Pryor is now in post-production on another collaboration with Guillermo del Toro, with whom he co-wrote the screenplay. This is his upcoming horror film, The Boy in the Iron Box, which, according to IMDb, features more snowy mountains and something hidden in a maze-like fortress. Given the atmospherics of AM 1200, The Empty Man, and The Autopsy, I am very much hoping it lives up to expectations. It's due to hit Netflix at some point in 2026, so I guess we don't have long to wait. Coincidentally enough, the other episode of Cabinet of Curiosities that I enjoyed comes from our second director of the week. This was The Viewing, which was written and directed by Panos Cosmatos. And that, of course, brings us on, almost seamlessly, to our second movie and his feature film debut. This is Beyond the Black Rainbow from 2010, which stars Michael Rogers and Eva Allen. Panos Cosmatos came to widespread attention with his sophomore feature Mandy, starring Nicolas Cage and Andrea Riseborough, which was released in 2018. However, even before this, there was an earlier group of devotees speaking highly about his debut feature, Beyond the Black Rainbow, which earned many comparisons to the early works of David Cronenberg. Panos was born in Italy in 1974. His mother was a Swedish experimental sculptor named Birgitta, and his father was the Greek-Italian filmmaker George P. Cosmatos, the director of films including Rambo: First Blood Part 2, the science fiction horror Leviathan in 1989, and the 1993 western Tombstone. As you can imagine, growing up in such a household exposed the young Panos to the visual arts at a very early age, particularly films, of which his father was an avid collector. Panos later recalled that he was watching films pretty much from the day that he was born, and that as his father would tape movies off cable channels when he was in LA, they had an enormous collection of thousands of movies that he was able to dip into throughout his whole life and from every era imaginable. In interviews, he has said that it was through a mutual love of film that he and his father really bonded, recalling that his best memories were of them watching films together and discussing them afterwards. After a period living in Sweden, the family moved to Victoria, British Columbia in the early 1980s, where George made the psychological horror of Unknown Origin. This features Peter Weller as a man who becomes obsessed with killing a rat in his New York brownstone. While I am more than familiar with the old VHS artwork which graced my local video store, I haven't actually seen the film, though Stephen King has said it's one of his favourite horror movies, and it's also Panos' favourite of his father's films. It's the one, he says, that from a creative standpoint he relates to the most, referring to it as a J.G. Ballard-esque story about a yuppie versus a rat. By the time his family moved to Canada in 1983, the home video market had really taken off, with a video store on every corner, each containing a horror section filmed with incredibly lurid covers. Although he grew up watching pretty much every genre of cinema, he was not allowed to watch R-rated movies. So he would spend his time in a local video store called the Video Attic, staring at the covers they had on display and trying to imagine what the films they contained might be like. It was this experience that prompted the look and feel of Beyond the Black Rainbow, a project that he has described as an attempt to make a remembered or imagined film, Eventually, the world of the R-rated movie was opened up to him, and he recalls that it was watching Martin Scorsese's 1985 film After Hours and Sam Raimi's Evil Dead 2 from 1987 that really made him want to direct. Watching them back to back, he observed, quote, "The styles of those films are so exaggerated, the camera moves are so exaggerated, and there's a satirical dark comedy feeling to them that's so overt. At that point, it clicked in my mind that this is what I wanted to do." End quote. He began writing screenplays and experimenting with short films, creating both as a learning process to help him explore filmmaking. He also worked with local bands doing cover art and graphic design, but ultimately, he said, he just watched a lot of movies, read a lot about films, and that was basically his film school. His first break in the film industry came with the movie Tombstone, on which he worked as a second-unit video assist operator, and this benefited him, both in terms of experience and also financially, as he would eventually use the money from the DVD residuals to shoot Beyond the Black Rainbow. Sadly, his mother Birgitta died in 1997, an event that hit him incredibly hard. Without realizing it, he drifted into what he called slow-motion self-destruction and binge drinking to avoid dealing with her passing. At this time, he also began drafting the screenplay for what would become Beyond the Black Rainbow. This was initially a low-budget black-and-white movie about a girl in an institute, but for whatever reason, the idea really never grew much beyond that. When his father George died in 2005, Panos realized that he needed to deal with the unprocessed grief following his mother's death, as well as the new emotions surrounding his father's. He chose to go into therapy, something that he says gave him clarity for the first time in many years. And he also realized that he had to make a movie immediately, or he might never make one at all. His creative process was also triggered by nostalgia, reminiscing about the early 1980s when his family first moved to Canada and he would spend his time in the video attic, creating imagined movies. It comes as no surprise then that Beyond the Black Rainbow is set in 1983 and also has a look and feel that is not so much trying to emulate the era, but feels more as if it actually belongs there. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so my usual warnings apply moving forward. The film opens with the numbers 1983 slowly appearing on the screen, accompanied by a discordant electronic synthesizer. And if the numbers on the screen, appearing in an apparent homage to the opening of Alien, didn't tell us that we were in the 80s, then the score certainly does. This is immediately followed by the retro sequence of a videotape being slid into a top-loading video player, with the image reduced to a very 1980s pillar box framing. From here, we see a promotional video for the Arboria Institute, fronted by its founder, Dr. Mercurio Arboria. Accompanied by the low electronic synthesizer of the film's excellent and evocative score, Arboria tells us of his vision. Quote, "It has long been my dream to find the perfect way for people to achieve simple happiness, contentment, and peace. These seem to be things that strangely elude us all, but it doesn't have to be that way. We here at Arboria have found a path to achieve them. Here at the Institute, we are at the forefront worldwide in neuropsychology and new therapeutic technologies. Dr. Barry Nile, our head of research, myself, and our dedicated team of herbalists, naturopaths, and healers have found a way to make that dream a reality. Through our unique blend of benign pharmacology, sensory therapy, and energy sculpting, we can guide you gently along the path to a new, better, happier you. All in the comfortable surroundings of our state-of-the-art facility and our award-winning gardens. We invite you to join us and find out for yourself." End quote. And as he speaks, slogans and epithets appear on the screen, each promising an escape into happiness through pure marketing speak. A practical application of an abstract ideal, born of a dream to create a reality, a different way to think, a new way to live, a perfect way to believe. All very tempting, I'm sure you will agree, and who wouldn't want a perfect way to live in happiness, contentment and peace? But, as we all know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, so it probably doesn't come as too much of a surprise to learn that things at the Institute have turned incredibly sour. This sequence immediately calls to mind the opening of David Cronenberg's 1975 movie Shivers, also known as They Came From Within. This opens with a similar promotional sequence, this time promoting the Starliner Towers, a particularly sterile apartment block just outside of Montreal. There is also more than a whiff of Cronenberg in the naming of Dr. Arboria, and his institute also calls to mind clinics in Cronenberg's other films, like the Soma-Free Institute for Psychoplasmics in 1979's The Brood, and the Canadian Academy for Erotic Inquiry that we find in his 1969 short film Stereo. And the promises and philosophies are also, of course, reminiscent of the Pontifex Institute of the Empty Man. And so, if you haven't guessed by now, the linking theme of this week's movies is cults and self-help groups, something I couldn't share at the top of the show in case people hadn't seen The Empty Man. But now that I have thoroughly spoiled the narrative of that film, I think it's safe enough to reveal it. The late 1960s and 1970s saw a surge of so-called self-help groups and technologies, some of which deteriorated into cults, and some of which evolved into the corporate monstrosities embodied by the Empty Man's Pontifex Institute. Many of these can be linked to what is known as the human potential movement, which rose from the ashes of the 1960s counterculture and is based on the belief that within everyone lies untapped and extraordinary potential, if only we knew how to unlock it. The reason that the 1970s saw such a blossoming of such groups was down to several factors. As mentioned, there was the collapse of the 1960s counterculture. There was also a distrust of traditional institutions, a growing interest in Eastern spirituality and philosophy, and also the development of what has been called the Me Decade, a period that focused on personal transformation and individual growth. But whatever the reasons, groups that may have seemed fringe in previous decades now seem to be everywhere, and also incredibly popular. One of the earliest of these was the Silver method, also known rather more ominously as Silver mind control. This was developed in the 1940s by an American electronics repairman called Jose Silver, who developed an interest in psychology as a means of improving his daughter's IQ. He also started to believe that she was demonstrating clairvoyance, and this led to the development of his mind control method. The method claims to help people reach and sustain an alpha state with a brainwave frequency of 7 to 14 Hz. Through doing this, which is achieved through meditation and visualization, he claims that people could improve their intelligence and higher brain functions, including clairvoyance. After years of research and experimentation with family members and volunteers, he made his research public in the 1960s, and then in 1978 he published a best-selling book called The Silver Mind Control Method. Although it has been described as self-religion and pseudoscience, the method has a significant following, and his website still offers courses on intuition, healing, sleep, and manifestation. I personally have no experience of the method or his teachings, so I cannot say whether they are effective or not. And it also has to be said that this method is possibly the most innocuous of the various technologies and groups I'm going to mention in this episode. A similar methodology was promoted by a seminar company called Mind Dynamics, founded in Texas in 1968 by a man called Alexander Everett. This was essentially a personal development movement, focusing on consciousness expansion, visualization, and intuition training. The objective was to help individuals unlock their potential, improve their performance, and achieve their goals. An overarching principle was that it taught clients to align their thoughts with what they called a universal mind or a collective unconscious, and that by tapping into this, they would be able to achieve success, health, and of course, money. However, the company was rather short-lived. In December 1972, they were investigated for fraudulent representation of the benefits of their methods, and in 1973, the state of California sued them for the unlawful practice of medicine. Although they ceased operating shortly afterwards, several other personal development groups rose from their ashes, including one of the most controversial, Erhard Seminars Training, or EST. EST was developed by Werner Hans Erhard, who was actually born John Paul Rosenberg in Philadelphia in 1935. He became involved with mind dynamics in 1970, and shortly after this began teaching his own version in San Francisco and LA. He then went on to develop his own program, which was launched in 1972, and this was a 2-weekend program that aimed, once again, to help attendees achieve their true potential. Critics of the method highlighted the use of what they called cult-like tactics, which included restricted bathroom access, limited food, and very long days. There was also intense and deliberate verbal confrontation, designed to break participants down before rebuilding them, and also various forms of psychological harassment. Critics and psychologists alleged that the training included mind control techniques and claimed that some participants experienced severe emotional problems as a result, including incidents of psychosis during or shortly after sessions. Despite this, the trainings were wildly popular, attracting thousands until the final seminar, which was held in San Francisco in 1984. Following this, Erhard replaced EST with what he called a more gentle approach to these same philosophies, which he initially called the Forum. In 1991, he sold the intellectual property rights to some of his employees, who incorporated it into an organization called Landmark Education Corporation, now a global organization known as Landmark Worldwide. The most famous of their courses is the Landmark Forum, a self-help or awareness workshop that runs over 3.5 days from 9 a.m. to 10 p.m. plus an evening session. Although there have been many who have reported long-lasting benefits from the experience, critics have labelled it a new religious movement, a corporate religion, and of course, a cult. The most significant criticism stems from the amount of stress the course is alleged to induce in participants, and also its hard sell recruitment tactics. The Landmark Forum do not advertise, but suggest that participants recruit friends and relatives as new customers, a strategy that many have labelled a human Ponzi scheme. Other organisations include The Seed, which was founded in 1970 as a youth self-help programme, but which was accused of using, once again, long confrontational sessions and mind control techniques. And then there was also Synanon. This began life as a drug rehab program, but evolved into a communal movement once described as the most dangerous cult in America, with members convicted of evidence tampering, terrorism, and attempted murder. Naturally, all of this makes great content for the horror genre. Some of the films that use this as a theme include The Invitation from 2015, the earlier mentioned Taylor Erickson group of Tears of Kali, and of course David Cronenberg's Soma Free Clinic, the practices of which are disturbingly close to EST training, just without the mutant children. And of course, we also have the Institutes of the Empty Man and Beyond the Black Rainbow. Cosmatos has said that he viewed Arborea as naive, and that while he may have started off with the best of intentions, his ego ultimately got in the way, and his philosophy and work became poisonous and destructive. Eventually, his work stopped being about humanity and became about an unattainable goal, the black rainbow of the title, which the director says is, quote, trying to achieve some kind of unattainable state that is ultimately probably destructive, end quote. Following the promotional video, we are introduced to the story proper, though I'm not sure story is the right word for what is essentially a hypnotic, sprawling dreamscape of psychedelia. This is an incredibly slow burn movie that is more about mood than it is about plot. Cosmatos has gone on to say that he wanted the film to operate as a moving Rorschach test, allowing the viewer to project their own anxieties or personal experiences onto the archetypes on the screen. To achieve this, he deliberately pared down the story and dialogue of his earlier drafts, ensuring that the more hypnotic elements of the movie would come to the forefront. So this is certainly not a film that would pass Netflix's two-screen approach to movie making. And to be frank, if you're not in the right mood for it, sometimes it doesn't exactly pass a one-screen approach either. But if you're able to surrender to its deliberately slow and trance-like pacing, there is plenty here to be dazzled by. The film concerns a mute telekinetic girl called Eleanor, who is being held at the Institute for observation. The man observing her is Barry Nile, who, as we learned in the prologue, is Arboria's assistant. He is played by Canadian actor Michael Rogers, who gives a spectacularly creepy performance as the chief antagonist. Wearing a terrible wig and a permanently smug expression, he spends his days psychologically torturing Eleanor, while, as we later discover, also harbouring incredibly disturbing sexual thoughts about her. At home, he lives with his partner, Rosemary, a very kind but incredibly lethargic woman who seems to be sedated to the point of catatonia. Not that she is the one in the relationship taking drugs. Soon after his arrival home, we see Barry take pills from a prescription bottle kept in the bathroom cabinet. The label on this medication, Benway, takes us into the world of William Burroughs, as well as offering a commentary on Barry's character. Dr. Benway is a recurring character in William Burroughs' work, first appearing in the novel Naked Lunch. Across this and other books, Burroughs demonstrates that Benway is a man with no conscience, that he is pathologically selfish, and that he acts with complete indifference to the well-being of other people. To put it mildly, Dr. Benway, said Burroughs, is a manipulator and coordinator of symbol systems, an expert in phases of interrogation, brainwashing, and control. This very simple act of show, don't tell, highlights some of the themes that Panos wanted to play with in the movie. Quote, these are themes that interest me, social control mechanisms, religion, and what that means in our society and in our consciousness, our own personal internal controls. Those are what interest me, but I wanted the film to be like slow-motion suspense, almost like macroscopic suspense. And I just wrote the thing in a very stream of consciousness way. I didn't really intellectualize it that much until I was trying to structure it. End quote. The control in the film is imposed and maintained by a glowing crystal, which sends out an energy field, regulating Eleanor's ability to use telekinesis, or indeed move. When it is switched on, her powers are rendered harmless, but when switched off, as when Barry weaponizes the girl to eliminate Nurse Margot, then her abilities are given free rein. And as for Margot herself, Panos has said that in writing the character, he was inspired by the idea of a deeply unpleasant bank teller, which was indeed the direction that he gave actress Rondell Reynoldson when she was hired for the role. The reference to Benway gives us pretty much all the information that we need to know about Barry, but even if you weren't a fan of Burroughs, you would probably have been able to gather much of it from Michael Rogers' facial expressions, cold, self-satisfied, and seething with innate violence. He is perhaps one of the finest portrayals of genuine psychopathy that we have seen in modern horror, far more so, I would argue, than the much-lauded pantomime villainy of Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter. Found through the audition process, Rogers nailed the part immediately and became Panos' first choice, particularly for his line delivery, which was imbued with a perfect and often hilarious smug arrogance. Rogers has called the film both challenging and rewarding. Challenging because he had to play two incarnations of the same character, and rewarding because of the film's abstract beauty. He's also said that while he has never really been a fan of science fiction, working on the film gave him a far better appreciation for the genre. He's also called the preparation for the film intense, which is a pretty good adjective for his performance, particularly during the second half of the film. Eleanor is played by Eva Bourne, though the casting process for this role was more of a challenge than the casting for Barry Nile. Cosmatos auditioned more people for that character than for any of the others, and part of the audition process focused on how the performer would be affected by the power of the crystal's electronic waves. While the director said that many of the actors didn't really understand the concept, Eva Bourne, quote, immediately seemed to understand what it means to be attacked by an invisible energy field, end quote. Bourne has said that as soon as she read the script, she wanted the part, saying that she had never read anything like it before, and that she was able to emotionally connect with both the character and the story. Her audition was apparently so primal and perfect for the role that Cosmatos didn't want to overburden her with backstory or his own ideas as to how he wanted the character depicted. As a result, he spoke to her very little off set, and only tried to guide her a little when she was on camera. Despite, or perhaps because of this, Bourne has called him one of the coolest directors that she has ever worked with, particularly admiring his creative mind and originality of thought. She has said that playing the role was draining for her, but that, as a younger actor, she felt able to let herself go and fully immerse in the experience, saying that she really understood and felt deeply for what the character was going through. For the first half of the film, we know little at all about the characters or why they are in this situation. We know that Eleanor is kept apart from her father and also that her mother has died. But the disclosure as to who they might be only occurs midway through the film, through use of a grainy, monochromatic flashback sequence. Here it is revealed that Barry was the subject of an experiment conducted by Dr. Arboria, a procedure meant to help him transcend beyond human experience. Submerged into a pool of dark liquid, with a third eye painted on his forehead, Arboria tells him to, quote-unquote, bring home the motherlode, Barry. At this point, Barry may be in the world of sensory deprivation hallucination, much like Ken Russell's 1980 movie, Altered States, or he may, in fact, have entered another dimension. But either way, he emerges completely deranged and kills the woman assisting in the procedure. This, as it turns out, was Eleanor's mother and also Arboria's wife. Rather than being upset by his wife's death, it is inferred that Arboria then decides to perform the same experiment using his own infant daughter. In the present, Arboria, now old and senile, lives in a room at the Institute and is killed with a drug overdose by Barry, who uses his mentor's death as an opportunity for rebirth. Removing what his wife Lorraine calls his appliances and revealing exactly what the experiment turned him into, he becomes a violent and cold-blooded killer, almost alien in appearance as he crushes Lorraine's skull while dressed in a leather suit from a manufacturer called Noriega. This is presumably a reference to Manuel Noriega, the military ruler of Panama between 1983 and 1989, whose regime was characterized by a surveillance state, the suppression of democracy, oppression, and drug trafficking, emphasizing the film's themes once again. The narrative of strange experiments, a telekinetic orphan, pools of dark liquid, and mysterious 1980s institutes may now sound a little familiar, particularly if you were a fan of the Netflix behemoth that was Stranger Things, and you wouldn't be the first to make that comparison. Nearly a decade ago, a YouTube channel called The Bible Machine noticed it too, and even made a video of comparative sequences, even highlighting the similarities between the names Eleanor and 11. Stranger Things creators, the Duffer Brothers, have also been asked about it, saying in a 2016 interview with The Hollywood Reporter that while Matt had watched a little of Black Rainbow and thought it was cool, Ross had never seen it, suggesting that maybe it had influenced his brother, but not him. And while these similarities are, it has to be said, rather startling at points, I would suggest that Stranger Things contains far more DNA from Stephen King's Firestarter than it does from this movie. While the two may both be set in the 1980s, there is a key difference in their aesthetic, with Stranger Things a far more commercial homage to the period, and Beyond the Black Rainbow more like a film that could actually have been made during that era. Cosmatos has called his film a stripped-down version of 80s aesthetic, saying, quote, "The idea of creating a retro world isn't all that appealing to me by itself. I wanted to take that and boil it down to a very potent brew version of that. I was trying to create a nightmare-heightened version of that retro aesthetic." End quote. Suffice it to say then, you're not going to hear many renditions of Kate Bush or Tiffany here. What you will hear, though, is the brilliant score composed by Jeremy Schmidt, working here under his performance name, Sonoya Caves. Schmidt is also the keyboardist for a Canadian indie rock band called Black Mountain, of which Panos is a big fan. Despite this, he remained unaware of the musician's solo work until Schmidt's girlfriend, who was a friend of Panos, sent him some of the music, thinking he might like some. He says he found it so inspiring that he even wrote new material in the screenplay based on Schmidt's compositions. Once he discovered Schmidt's solo work, he knew he wanted him to compose the score, and on receiving a rough cut of the movie, the musician agreed. In an interview with Vice magazine, Schmidt explained that the two connected over shared sensibilities and that Panos gave him pretty much free rein. He went on to say that technically speaking, the entire score could have been recorded in the year that the film actually takes place, 1983, as he used old analog synthesizers that date from the same period. In addition to the fantastic score, there is also a very impressive sound design by Eric Poole, which adds to the oppressive atmosphere of the film. Poole, who is a musician as well as a sound designer, merged his work with Schmidt's score, including counting down the beats per minute and tuning his own work so that at moments the two blend seamlessly. This provides an ambient and haunting landscape for the film's key selling point, its impressive and hallucinatory visuals. The film was shot in Vancouver on an old Panavision camera from the 1980s, with cinematography by Norm Lee. Lee was brought onto the project on the strength of a reel for his first feature, Altitude, and was initially sold on the elevator pitch, "It's like THX 1138 meets Blade Runner." On reading the script, he says he fell in love with the movie's simplicity and style. On meeting with Panos and discussing references, Lee decided that the best option would be to shoot on 35mm, an idea which initially seemed financially out of reach for the self-funded project. Fortunately, Lee was able to speak with contacts at Panavision, Technicolor and Fujifilm, where they established that the Panavision 35mm camera would save up to 50% on both film stock and processing costs, so it made both a logical and aesthetic choice. Lee has said that following extensive conversations and test shoots, much of the look of the film was achieved in camera. He admits that there was a little bit of tweaking done in the color grade, but basically everything we see in terms of the primary colors, lighting and flaring was done on set and was achieved through the choice of film and also deliberate overexposure. Many of his visual inspirations came from childhood nightmares, which influenced how he framed certain sequences and moved or didn't move the camera. Filmically, though, he has also cited Phantasm from 1979, THX 1138 from 1971, 1974's Dark Star, and Suspiria from 1977, something that probably comes as no surprise to anyone who has seen both films. For his part, Cosmatos has also cited THX 1138 and Dark Star, but says that much of the visual inspiration comes from a film called Phase 4. This is a 1974 science fiction horror directed by Saul Bass, and if you enjoy the visual feel of Beyond the Black Rainbow, I would say it's one to track down. It's available for rental on YouTube and through Paramount, if you're interested. On its original release, Panos has described the reception as, quote, kind of muted and even downright negative, end quote, though it did start to fare much better after a successful screening at the 2011 Tribeca Film Festival. A polarising film that plays like an ambient nightmare, it's not surprising that to this day the film garners mixed reviews and feedback, earning legions of new fans and, in equal number, legions of people who find it confusing. A very slow and hypnotic mood piece, it isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea, particularly given the director's objective that he wants the viewer to project their own emotions and memories onto it. But if you're in the mood for some anxiety-inducing reflection, I highly recommend it, though I would also suggest avoiding any edibles before pressing play. In interviews given at the time of the film's release, the director told journalists that his next film would be the flip side of Black Rainbow, and that instead of making a film about control and repression, he was writing a screenplay about the venting of emotion and primal expression. This would become the movie Mandy, which starred Nicolas Cage and Andrea Riseborough, and was released in 2018, and we'll be covering this in more detail in a few weeks' time. He followed this with The Viewing, his contribution to the Cabinet of Curiosities, and according to IMDb, he now has 2 films in pre-production, Flesh of the Gods and Necrocosm. He has described Necrocosm as fantastical and bizarre, and said that it embodies his interests and preoccupations far more than ever before. He's also said he hopes it will be a crowd pleaser, because the one he will be making afterwards is far more dark and existential. That film will be Flesh of the Gods, a project that was announced with both Kristen Stewart and Oscar Isaac attached. The director describes this as, quote, both propulsive and hypnotic. It will take you on a hot rod joyride deep into the glittering heart of hell, end quote. Personally, I can't wait for both, particularly Flesh of the Gods, which is from a screenplay by Andrew Kevin Walker, the writer of Seven. Whether that's a winning combination in practice, only time will tell, but I hope, in my heart of hearts, that it will be. The Empty Man and Beyond the Black Rainbow are, of course, both films about nefarious self-help groups, luring in devotees with dubious philosophies while hiding a more dangerous intent. Both are also films that allude to cosmic horror and unnameable things that, once glimpsed, lead to violence and insanity. One is a dreamlike exploration of oppression and control, and the other a nihilistic occult detective story. Together, they suggest that the journey to self-discovery is a voyage into madness, and that while the monsters beyond the void may be utterly terrifying, it is the people who act as their messengers that we need to be truly afraid of. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, you can always email the horrordouble@gmail.com and follow the Instagram account @thehorrordouble. Next week, we are exploring the horrors of colonialism with another classic from producer Val Luton and a shape-shifting horror from Hammer. So first up, we have I Walked with a Zombie from 1943, directed by Jacques Tourneur and starring Francis D., Tom Conway, Edith Barrett and Christine Gordon. We follow this with The Reptile from 1966, directed by John Gilling. This stars Jennifer Daniel, Noel Willman, Ray Barrett and Jacqueline Pearce. And if you'd like to watch along, You can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion. Until then, thank you once again very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.